We're in Mark chapter 2. If you'd like to go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 2. We'll begin at verse 13, do some little bit of background on what we've been talking about. Mark 2:13 through 17 opens up with what we've seen already many times in the Gospel of Mark, and that is there are great crowds coming to Jesus. He's surrounded by people, and it seems like that's an ongoing theme already. We haven't gone very far, so it's already one of those things that seems to be at the center of Mark's observation about Jesus, because he's 1.5 chapters into his gospel, and one of those things that he's highlighted is that Jesus is surrounded at all times by these groups and by these crowds, and what's going on is that he is healing and casting out evil spirits and those kinds of things. So you have in verse 13, you have Jesus teaching them, and one of the things that he has done, as he says here, as it says here, he's teaching, and one of the things that he's already said is that he has come in order to teach. And so the thing that's going on here is exactly what he wanted to do, and that is to teach the people. And then you have this story of Levi, the tax collector, and this is in the midst of what we talked about being this series of conflict. There's this whole series, there's 5 of them that surround this whole idea of Jesus and the conflict with the religious leaders of the day, whether it be the scribes or the Pharisees or whomever it would be. There's this ongoing conflict, and you might remember that early on that the first real theme that we really saw, or the thing that was highlighted often in chapter 1 and the early part of chapter 2 was the authority of Jesus. So the word authority was used often, and it was used to talk about Jesus' teaching, about his ability to heal people, about his ability to cast out demons. And so you have this idea of authority. It's followed by his authority being challenged by the religious elite, by those that are religious of the day. So you have immediately when he chooses Levi and he goes into this eating with the sinners and tax collectors, there is this conflict that arises. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? That's verse 16. Verse 17, Jesus heard it. He said, "Those who are well have no need of physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." And that's the whole idea of what we have here in verses 13 through 17. Jesus having this conflict with the religious of the day, the ones who watch him and the ones who are following him, those that are looking for something to have against him. In this particular case, it calls them out as the scribes, verse 16. The scribes, when they saw he was eating with the sinners and tax collectors, this is what their question was. And so in verse 17, Jesus responds. Now, we move into the next verses in chapter 2, verse 18, and there is this question about fasting. And this will be another conflict. This is going to be in this series of conflict stories, and we're going to see this conflict that's going to pick up beginning in 18, and it's going to go really through verse 22, 18 through 22, and you're going to see this additional series of conflict stories, or it's going to be added to, and you're going to have the last couple of those here that are going to be the fourth and fifth one in this series of 5 conflicts that Jesus has. So I hope you can see that in these first 2 chapters, what happens is that you have the laying out of the authority of Jesus beyond any doubt. Mark highlights the fact that Jesus has authority over disease. He has authority over evil spirits. He has authority to teach like no others have ever had before. He's able to teach without any other help or any other authority being referred to. He is the authority. And now what we have is that authority being challenged, the series of conflicts that he gets into because of his doing what he came to do, or doing what he would normally do as the Savior or the King of the kingdom, and that is to help his subjects. And he's doing that by healing, by casting out demons, by teaching them, and he continues to do all of that all the way up through the end of chapter 2. Actually, into chapter 3, we're going to see 3, probably won't get all the way there tonight, but chapter 3, 1 through 6 is going to end this series of conflicts that Jesus is having, and he's going to perform that last miracle there in chapter 3, 1 through 6. And not the last miracle, but the miracle that's going to cause great conflict here in this series. So if somebody would read 18 through 22. That's chapter 2, 18 through 22.
The disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples, the disciples of the Pharisees, are fasting, but yours are not? Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No one pours new wine into old wineskins. Into new wineskins, excuse me.
Okay, that's through verse 22. Now let's kind of break this down and see what's taking place, because as it opens up in verse 18, 19 is going to begin Jesus' response to them. But their question is, John's disciples and the Pharisees are fasting. Now we don't know why they're fasting. We don't know if they are following a regular fast. From what I understand, the Jews had several prescribed fasts, and from some of the readings that I've done over the years, one of the things that seems to be true as well in the first century is that the Pharisees, in order to appear more holy, would fast more often. Now some have speculated that wasn't always as it appeared to be necessarily. And Jesus is going to confront this at one time in his ministry with the Pharisees. But you know, you can make yourself look worse if you doctor yourself up with, say, ashes under your eyes, or you mess your hair up, or you wear big baggy clothes that makes you look like you're weak, you maybe you've lost some weight. And so it's suspected that the Pharisees would say, I'm more holy than you because I fast every Tuesday and Thursday. And look at me, you can tell I do that because you can see my eyes are hollow, my clothes don't fit well, whatever might be the case. But we don't know why they're fasting. We don't know what's going on here exactly, but it may have been a prescribed fast that had come up under Judaism, that was maybe under the law that they had made up, not necessarily the law of Moses, but their law. And when it adds the Pharisees here, it makes you think that this was something that they had come up with and said, hey, everybody needs to do this in order to be righteous like we are. Because Jesus confronts that. But before we go to Jesus' confrontation, let's finish what's taking place. So the question is, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? Okay, there were two things that were going on in Old Testament, in the context of Old Testament fasting. One of those was that oftentimes fasting was connected to sorrow. It was connected to the idea of pain or struggle or something of that nature. It was connected to mourning. It was connected to that. So you see the idea of fasting, sackcloth and ashes, and all of that would go with this whole surrounding bit of mourning that's going on. Humility. Yeah, okay. Well, that's connected to that as well, as you think about the one of the reasons for the fasting. And then also there's the kind of fasting that would be prescribed to let you demonstrate, as Dale said, the humility as well as your submission to God and your eagerness to get to know Him and concentrate on Him and become closer to Him, so that what you've done is you're not focusing any longer on the worldly things. You're not wondering what you're going to have for the next meal. You're not concerned about cooking. You're not concerned about getting everything ready. You're only concerned about your drawing closer to God. That seems to be a major tenet or a major purpose for this idea of fasting. So the thing that is asked is, why do your disciples not fast? We don't know why John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are, but when he is asked the question, why do your disciples not fast? So Jesus' response is interesting, to say the least, because what he responds with is this example or this story about the wedding feast and the whole idea of this week-long wedding feast that takes place. And at the end of all of that, then you have the bride and the groom coming together and being united at the end of all of this feasting that takes place. And so what Jesus says is, my disciples are not in mourning. They are not saddened. They are not in need of searching for the King and searching for a relationship with the King, because I am here. I'm here. I'm with them. So that's what he says. Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. Okay, what do they do for 7 days in a Jewish wedding in the first century when Jesus is talking? What are they doing for the first 6.5 days? What do? They feast. They eat. They gain weight. It's a festival. That's where we get the word feast, festival. It's a festival. It is a celebration. It is a time of joy and wonder and amazement, and you're celebrating the bride and the bridegroom. It's a time of wonderful celebration for a whole week. Would it be appropriate if you decided, I'm not going to partake in all of that, I'm going to sit over here in the corner and look all sad with my hands crossed in my lap, and I'm not going to partake of any of this wonderful food that these hosts have prepared for me? Would that be right? Well, that would be offensive, wouldn't it? That would be offensive to the host. That would be offensive to the bride and the groom, that you're not joining in to the feast that's going on every day that leads up to the time when the bride and the groom come together. And Jesus says, the bridegroom is with them. What need do they have to fast? What need do they have to give up this this wonderful moment of celebration that they have with the king of the kingdom. I'm the king. I brought the kingdom into existence. I'm telling you, the kingdom is near. I'm the king. I'm bringing it into existence. So it wouldn't be right for them to mourn and fast in the presence of the bride and the groom, would it? That just wouldn't be appropriate. That would be offensive. You know, in some countries, if you're offered a gift and you refuse it, it's an insult. You have this kind of setting going on in first century Judaism, and if you do not participate in this festival, then it would be an offense. It would be offensive. So Jesus says, common sense, you don't mourn, you don't weep, you don't fast, you don't do any of that because the bridegroom is in your presence. He's here. You don't do any of that because he is present. Now he's going to be taken away, and then, and that time, they will fast. And that time, there's going to be a time of reflection, a time of contemplation, a time even to mourn and weep, to grow closer to God, to have this moment of introspection and outer devotion that's going to be demonstrated. But right now, they're not concerned about fasting because the bridegroom is here. All right, observations? Anything you'd like to add? Verses 18 through 20. We'll get to 21, 22 in just a minute.
You know, you're not supposed to make yourself up when you fast. I think Jesus even says, if you do fast, wash your face, pour oil on your head, look good.
He does, yes.
So the people won't know that you're fasting.
Mm-hmm.
Make it look like, you know, you're okay with everything you're doing. It's up to you. It's a personal thing. It's not an outward thing.
Exactly. Yeah, the perspective that Jesus has on that, John refers to that as well, is it's between you and God, and for you to make a show of it is blasphemy. I mean, he doesn't use that, but it is. If you're doing it for the show, then you might as well not do it. Anything else? Okay, 21 and 22. Quite an interesting statement, two statements that are made here by Jesus as well, because he refers to the sewing of a piece of unshrunk cloth onto an old garment, and he refers to putting new wine into old skins. So let's take both of those and see if we can gain a little bit of insight into what's going on here. Now, these two illustrations are pretty easy for the first century person to understand, and for us it might need a little bit of clarification. But if you take a piece of cloth that is a piece of new cloth and has not been prepared, has not been washed, has not been used and softened and done with what needs to be done in order to make it an old piece of old cloth, and you sew that piece of new cloth onto a new garment, when that new piece of cloth begins to shrink, what's going to happen? It's going to tear, isn't it? It's going to tear away. So that one's pretty easy to understand. When that new piece of cloth begins to shrink, then it's going to tear away the stitches that are put in it to connect it to that old piece of cloth. Then the second illustration he uses is putting new wine in old wineskins. Now there's some difference of opinion on exactly what the wineskin would be. Some say it's a sawn leather pouch. Some say it is a goat or sheep stomach, right? Yeah, you take that out and dry it, and then you can use it as a container. You do what you have to do in order to do what has to be done. Okay, so you've got to have a container for your grape juice. You got to have a container. So if you take a piece of an old container, an old wineskin, and you fill it full of new grape juice, what's that grape juice going to do? It's going to begin to ferment. It does it in our refrigerator from time to time, especially apple juice, because we don't drink enough of it, and you open it and the lid goes boop. Okay, I think that's too old. We got to throw that one away. So it'll ferment and it begins to swell. Okay, so if you put it in a skin that is already been stretched and done its work, and Jesus even refers to it as an old skin, which means that it is fragile and brittle, and as that begins to ferment and as it begins to swell, it's going to burst. As a matter of fact, he says that if he does this, the wine will burst the skins. Okay, so he uses those two illustrations, and he says, if you sew a piece of new cloth onto an old garment, the patch will tear away from the garment, and so you've got a worse problem than you had before. And then he says, if you put new wine in old wineskins, you're not only going to burst the wineskin, but you're going to lose the wine. There's no way to save it. There's just no possible way. You ever opened a big soft drink that's been shaken up, and as soon as you open it, you realize that these elbows are flying here. As soon as you open it, you realize that you made a really big mistake, and it's just going everywhere. What do? You try to save it or put the lid back on as fast as you can or whatever. Well, there's no hope. What he says is there's no recourse. There's nothing you can do in order to save the wine, because you're going to lose the wine and the bag as well. So what does all this mean? What do these two illustrations mean? What does Jesus want to communicate here as he brings up these two illustrations that seem to make the same point, but he uses two illustrations, the old garment and the old wineskins? It seems what Jesus is trying to do here is to refer to the coming of the kingdom and how that Judaism will not fit in that kingdom. You can't take the old, you can't take what has already been and served its purpose and has completed its need, fulfilled its need. You can't take that which is old, Judaism, and you can't combine it with what I have brought and what I am bringing, which is the kingdom, the new kingdom. I am the king. I brought the kingdom. And so the possibility of mingling the two is not possible. You can't mingle the two. You can't take that which is old and bring it and add it to that which is new and make it work. It just will not work. Now, in the context of what's taking place, the fasting that was referred to in verse 18 would have been under an interpretation of the old law. Jesus explains, I am the bridegroom. I am here in their presence. There is no need to do any fasting, because what I have brought, what I am bringing is new. And what you're talking about and where you are living is in the old. Now, maybe I oversimplified it, or I hope I simplified it, but that seems to be what Jesus is communicating there by these two illustrations, the cloth and the wine. So what are your observations? Maybe you have a little better handle on it than I do.
Where that was injected in there, verse 21, 22.
Mm-hmm.
I realized about you don't put the old and the new, but I never could make a connection how that fit in.
Right. It seems to me that it fits that way because of what has just happened, and that is they're saying, why don't you fast? And he says, well, the reason is because the situation is different, and things are about to change where you'll not need any of that old any longer. Mm-hmm.
And that's what they want you to do. And of course, to get off base totally, just like in science, you know, so many people say, well, let's add the theory of evolution with the creation. We can make this work together. You can't do it.
No.
You've got to not take the new and keep the old in that situation.
Right.
But you know, it's just, it's a never, people will always do that. They'll try to compromise.
Right.
Jesus said, there's no compromise here.
No, it'll only end in disaster if you try to compromise. And all you have to do is go to the book of Galatians, and you'll see where they tried to meld these two together, the old law and the new law, the old law and the new kingdom that was ushered in by Jesus, and it didn't work. It doesn't work. There is only damnation that's the result when we try to put the two together. It just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the one of the things that I've heard injected there is what Mary says, is that their hearts had become like old wineskins, the Pharisees, scribes, those, and therefore they couldn't accept what was coming. I kind of struggle with that. I'm not sure about that interpretation, but I've heard that one before. Anything else? All right, let's go on to verse 23. We're going to have to read 23 through the end of the chapter, through 28, if someone would. 23 through 28.
And as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? He answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.
Okay, good. I'm going to break one of my rules here. I said, let's read it, just Mark, and don't go back to the others. But in this case, Matthew's account helps with the point here, and he really highlights this idea of Jesus being Lord of the Sabbath and his being one who is not controlled by their traditions or their ideas. So it seems that Jesus isn't real interested in defending himself. I don't know if you noticed that as he's confronted about this, the fact that his disciples plucked the heads of grain, and they were, remember, this is this conflict. This is the 4th out of 5, I think, that we've seen already. And so in this 4th conflict, the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Well, then Jesus talks about David and the circumstance where there was a have-to circumstance, but it seems that Jesus is not as interested in defending himself as he is teaching them something else. The idea of his being the Lord of the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. It seems that Jesus is intentional on saying that my disciples are not breaking the law of Moses. They're not doing that. So whatever their interpretation was, or however they had laid it down, or whatever was the call of one who was a sinful person, Jesus is saying they didn't do this. But what Jesus is also saying is that in this situation, I want you to understand that the Sabbath was made for the benefit of man. That's why the Sabbath was made. And when you start putting all of these barriers and you put so much weight on people where the Sabbath has become a burden, and everything you do or try to do on the Sabbath ultimately makes you a lawbreaker, then you have become judge, jury, and God yourself by making that which was supposed to be for man only something that was a burden and more difficult on everybody involved. So what Jesus' point seems to be is that there are needs that trump what you think is most important. There are needs in mankind that are more important than your solid and self-righteous view of what the Sabbath is really all about. We are no Sabbath breakers. As a matter of fact, Jesus would say, I am, again, I think he's bringing up his authority again. He's bringing up this by saying, I have authority over the Sabbath. That's my day. You don't make that call for me, Pharisees. You don't make that call. I am Lord of the Sabbath. What he's saying is, I'm greater than the law. I'm greater than your opinion of the law. I'm greater than all of those things that you might put before God and before man's needs. I am the authority, and I stand before you as the authority as Lord over the Sabbath. All right, observations or questions maybe?
They have elevators in Israel that only operate, let's put it this way, they call it the Sabbath elevator. If there's 12 stories in a building, they'll punch all 12 before the Sabbath, and you go up to the 12th floor, come back to the 11th, to 10th, but if there's an emergency, you're in trouble. Because you have to wait to go all the way down to 1 and then go all the way back up again.
Uh-oh. Yeah.
And it's just piling on traditions that are not scriptural.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, sometimes they can't wear certain shoes because they have nails in their heels.
Right.
And a nail creates a spark when it hits the rock. That's work. So, I mean, they just piling on tradition after tradition, and I think that's what Jesus said.
Yeah, you're making it hard on people by your adding to make it a burden rather than what it was intended to be. All right, I think we've got time. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 is the last conflict that, it's not the last, but it's the fifth conflict in this series of conflicts that Jesus has with the religious elite. Notice chapter 3, verse 1. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, Come here. And he said to them, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent, and he looked around at them and with anger grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel and the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Now, right there, we make this point while we're there, but at the end of verse 6 is a hard change in the book of Mark. There's a very hard change because you notice that you have this series of 5 conflicts, and what happens at the end of the 5th conflict? What is their conclusion? We're going to kill him. The word that they use here is that they get together and they discuss how we may destroy him. Now, we can let, if you want to, we don't have enough time, but we could let Ryan talk about the Herodians and all of that, and how they're stuffed right in here, right at the end of these verses. But you've got everybody that's against Jesus now. It's not just the Pharisees, it's not just the scribes, but you got the liberals and the conservatives against him right now, right, Ryan? You got them all against him. So here's a hard break in the book of Mark. Really strong break. Because after these series of conflicts, the decision is made, we've got to destroy this man. He has to die. And what brought it on? Here's the story about his healing the man with the withered hand. And what's quite fascinating is that when Jesus sees what's about to, well, that's not a good way to put it. Knowing what he's about to do, what's the question he asked of those religious leaders? Yeah. It's right there in verse 4. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to kill? They were silent. They didn't say a word. He gave them opportunity to speak. He gave them opportunity to let their opinion be known or their understanding be known, but there wasn't anything. Notice Jesus' response. Jesus looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, because he knew their heart. We don't, but he knew their heart. Again, I would put the word, the idea there of authority again, because Jesus now demonstrates the fact that he knows men's hearts. He's already done that a couple of times, even through chapter 2. But now at the beginning of chapter 3, he knows the men's hearts, and he knows they're hardened, and he knows what their response is going to be. He knows what's about to happen, and he is angry and he is grieved because of the condition of their heart. And then he says to the man, stretch out your hand, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees then go out and immediately hold counsel with the Herodians, and they decide he's got to die. They decide he has to die. Well, let me give you time. Our time is up. Let me give you time to respond. Anything?
They had to get rid of him, and they had to try to do something to restore what they had. So he was a threat.
He was a threat. He was a threat to the power that they held among the Jews, and he was also a threat because he demonstrated a power and an authority that they'd never seen before. And they knew if this kept going, that it was going to cause an avalanche of followers that they couldn't handle it. Because he's already started teaching against them, teaching against their traditions, teaching against them. So you've got this whole series of conflicts. It ultimately ends here with this healing of the man with the withered hand, and the conflict happens before he ever does the healing. You see that? There's no conflict after he does the healing. They didn't say, whoa, you did it on the Sabbath. You shouldn't have done it on the Sabbath. When he's healed him, what did they do? They just left. didn't they? When he healed the man with the withered hand, they left. They didn't say a word. They didn't chastise him. They didn't argue with him. They didn't ask him, why'd you do that on the Sabbath? They didn't do anything. They just left. Okay, thanks for your comments. We'll pick up there in verse 7 next week. Like I said, that changes the whole tenor and flavor of the book of Mark.